Thank you so much, Rabbi.
We have not found the 10 tribes that were part of that kingdom, therefore they're called the lost tribes. Two remaining tribes, actually three, it's Benjamin, Judah, Benjamin emerged in Judah, and the Levites survived until 586 when the Babylonian king kicked them out of Judah, and famously you see Nebuchadnezzar was his name, carrying off the treasure from King Solomon's temple into exile. Had that exile lasted a little bit longer, in all likelihood the Jewish people would not have survived, because it was a temple-oriented society. The temple was destroyed, people were evicted, but the Babylonian Empire did not last long. Cyrus, Persian king, defeated Nebuchadnezzar, and in 538 he encouraged the Jews to go back. Zerubbabel led 50,000 people. Ezra and Nehemiah came back about 30 years later, and they rebuilt the temple on a modest scale, and you had Jewish continuity in the land of Israel. So that continued through successive empires. We visited with the Romans. The Romans had another major exile after they destroyed the Second Temple in 70 CE. The Bar Kokhba revolt in 135 CE pretty much eradicated any hope of an independent Jewish sovereignty in what's now the state of Israel. For the duration of this course, I'm going to call that area the Yeshuv, because the Yeshuv is part and parcel with the Zionist movement that had early manifestations going back to really the time of the Amoraim. We learned that the Tanaim put together the Mishnah. They were mostly in the Yeshuv, and then a lot of the Babylonian, by the way, when the Babylonian Empire collapsed and Cyrus let the Jews go back in 538, not all of them went back. So there was a consistent, persistent presence, Jewish presence in Babylonia for 1,000 years. And after the Bar Kokhba revolt, the major yeshivot, the major houses of learning, we became more of a Pharisaic, more of a rabbinical synagogue, worshiping wherever, not so dependent on a temple. For practical reasons, we didn't have a temple. And there were movements to get people back to Israel, but it was surrounded by messianism, meaning that there was a hope that there would be the Messiah, we'd reclaim our land, rebuild our temple, and that really had sustained Jewish identity for 2 millennia. There were some very interesting incidents. Again, the prophecy is that the Messiah is likely to come after a calamitous period in Jewish history. Unfortunately, we've had too many calamitous periods in Jewish history, and therefore there were a lot of false starts. Can't go through all of them, but really, if you wanted to think of this class as a tour of the streets of Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, Haifa, Beersheba, major cities across Israel have streets named after heroes of the Bible, but also heroes of Zionism. So anytime now that you have a smartphone, Israel's got probably better Wi-Fi than most other countries. When you're next in Israel and you see a name on the street, you don't know who Katznelson was, you don't know who Hess was, you don't know who Pinsker was, you don't know who David El-Roi was, look it up. David El-Roi was a Kurd, he was a Jew living in Kurdistan, and he led a rebellion in 1160 to go back and claim the Jewish sovereignty in Israel. It failed. Somebody who does not have a street named after him is Shabtai Tzvi. He's famous for being the false Messiah. We've had several false Messiahs, but at the end of last class we talked about horrible pogroms the Jews suffered, and again it's hard to rank them, but there was a Cossack by the name of Chmelnytsky who in 1648 and 1649 tried to annihilate the Jews within the Pale of Settlement, and he failed, but hundreds of thousands of Jews were massacred. It probably was the most egregious example of systematic extermination in Jewish history until the Holocaust. And the spirit of Judaism in Eastern Europe was decimated. There was a Turkish Jew by the name of Shabtai Tzvi who took upon himself the mantle of redemption, and he was very, very popular. Unfortunately, It was yet another schism within the Jewish people living at the time, and this was during the Ottoman control of the land of Israel. The Turks actually captured him, gave him the choice to convert to Islam or die. So our future Messiah became a Muslim and died in Turkish prison. So no streets named after him. But this was all built around Messianic redemption. And wherever Jews were suffering, people were talking about coming back to Zion. And if you go throughout, the migrations of Jewish people to the Yishuv were directly correlated to how much suffering they endured in other countries. So we saw that they were kicked out of England in 1290, kicked out of France in 1391, kicked out of Austria in 1421, kicked out of Spain in 1492, kicked out of Portugal in 1497, trying to find new homes in various places, and some of them trickled in to the Yishuv. Through most of this history, the Yishuv was run by the Mamluks till 1517, and by the Ottomans from 1517 to 1917. They didn't really care much about that part of the world, even though they controlled it. Most Jews, during the period that interests us, started moving toward the Pale of Settlement. 1791 was a threshold year. The Jews were given rights for the first time by France, granted rights that then emerged into citizenship under Napoleon, but they were also confined into this Pale of Settlement by the Russian Tsar, and they lived poor, meager lives, were forced into certain professions, conscripted into the Russian army, and things kept getting progressively worse. You had different strains of what later on became Zionism percolating, especially during the period of the Haskalah. Moses Mendelssohn is famously associated with the Haskalah in Germany. He lived in the 18th century, in the 1700s, and he was the most prolific example of somebody who can get out of the ghetto. We saw the ghettos. They started in Venice in 1516, Rome 1555, and then it became a term all over Europe. You were either kicked out of a town or you were confined to a small place within that town. Moses Mendelssohn taught us that we can be part of an enlightened, cosmopolitan society. He translated the Bible into German. He was a hero. There's an expression, you want to get out of the ghetto. They use it even now for a different demographic. Then the idea was, if you want to get out of the ghetto, you become more like the people in the land that you're living. So you want to be more German if you're in Germany. You want to be more French if you're in France. So Moses Mendelssohn and the Haskalah movement also presented a very strong threat to the established Orthodox hegemony within Judaism. There's a large range of practice here. We're all in the synagogue, but some people are a little bit more observant, some people are a little bit less observant. Every one of us has a grandfather, great-grandfather, great-great-grandfather who was either a rabbi, a Torah scholar, an observant Jew. That was all there was. This idea of having differentiation among Judaism is relatively new. Pluralism is a relatively new concept. You were either in or you were out. If you were a little bit progressive like Spinoza, you were excommunicated because the ultra-Orthodox, or what we'd call the ultra-Orthodox, that term didn't exist at the time, that was all there was. And it wasn't very hard, it was impossible to integrate with the rest of society. Haskalah, the Enlightenment, 1848 was a critical year in Europe where you had this festering and fostering of nationalism, and people really wanted to feel like they were part of the societies, and for a period of time, it looked like it was going to work. So you had Jewish emancipation in France in 1791, 1865 in England, 1871 in Prussia. Jews became patriots in the land that they were living, including here in the United States. In the United States, we talked about the first Jews coming to New Amsterdam in 1654, and eventually finding a home, first in the South, then in other parts of the United States. And these were mostly German Jews and they became Reformed. They were so proud of being American that they didn't want to abandon their Judaism entirely, but they felt that being too Jewish was inconsistent with why they came to their promised land, which is the United States. Our rabbis from Pittsburgh, his father's fellow rabbi in Pittsburgh, the Pittsburgh platform introduced by the Reform movement today looks very controversial, but it flat out rejected Zionism. The Jewish community in the United States was not part of the original Zionist movement because they felt that they found their promised land. Their promised land was in America. So ironically, people who did yearn to return home to the Yeshuv, to Zion, were negated both by the enlightened Reform Jews and by the ultra-Orthodox. The ultra-Orthodox said it's not time yet. It's not time yet because the Messiah hasn't come. So that's, again, consistent with the Messianic trends that we saw earlier. 1881, all the years are important. You know, when we look at Jewish history, it all sorts of blends together. But the reason we stopped in 1880, because in 1881, Tsar Alexander II, who wasn't particularly good to the Jews, but he was among the more liberal Tsars, was assassinated. He was assassinated by a group that ultimately would lead to the Russian Revolution 36 years later. But and there were a series of Russian revolutions, and unfortunately we're going to cover them. Not unfortunately, we'll cover them all, but unfortunately they were all bad for us. His son, his second son, his first son died earlier, Nicholas. His son Alexander III was a horrible, horrible person. So we know of Stalin, we know of Hitler. Alexander III, pretty close to that category. His mentor, we talked about Constantine being the first anti-Semite. His mentor was Constantine. My mom will kill me for my Russian accent, but Pobodenetsov, who he was the head of the Holy Synod of the Russian Orthodox Church, and he basically instituted a state-sponsored program of pogroms. 1882 was the big one in Odessa, and they just never stopped. There were pogroms after pogroms after pogroms, on a small scale, but encouraged by the Tsar and his henchmen. And as a consequence, between 1882 and 1914, the Jewish population here in the United States increased over tenfold. 2 million Russian Jews moved to the United States. And that massively transformed the tapestry of Judaism here in the United States. Looking around the room, none of you moved here during that period, but some of your parents and grandparents were probably part of that immigration wave. And these people didn't care about Zionism, they cared about just finding a new life and escaping the horrors of what they endured in their old home. And when they got here, it was all about surviving. You know, it also changed the centers of demography and geography of the Jewish community here in the United States. You know, originally it was a very dominant Sephardic community living in the South. Charleston, South Carolina was the largest Jewish population until the 1830s. The new Jews who came at the end of the 19th century tend to congregate in the Northeast and the Midwest. So cities like New York, Chicago, Boston, Philadelphia became the new centers of Jewish life. And whether it's Delancey Street, Essex, Ellis Island, all these names are familiar to us because of that immigration wave. But not all of them came here. Some of them started going to Palestine. And today you hear about the Palestinians and the Israelis. There was no distinction. The Jewish people who wanted to go to the Yeshuv were going to Palestine. And the agencies that were set up to help them were Palestinian agencies, to help Palestinian Jews survive in what was a relatively inhospitable environment. And it wasn't inhospitable because, there were issues with the Arabs, and we'll take you through it, but the first Aliyah goes from, I would say 1882, time of these pogroms, till 1904. 35,000 Jews moved from mostly Russia to the Yeshuv, but there were people already there when they arrived.